Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on science-based targets. What is changing in 2026, and also when we take a look more forward. While we just let everyone settle into this webinar today and also just attend and get tuned in, I'll take the opportunity to walk us through some of the practical elements before we get started. First of all, my name is Mina Shukri. I will be your moderator for today's session here at Nordic Sustainability. I work as co-leading our climate team. This session will be around 45 minutes, and let's see how steady and easy I can guide us through it all. We will be talking about the famous science-based target today. We will look a bit into what has changed here in 2026, but also what do we expect to change in the near-term future when we look into 2027. We will both look at what will happen for companies that has already set targets and also for those of you who want to set targets. Before we, though, dive into the content for today's session, I just want to also mention that this webinar will be recorded. We will share the recording with all of you who've signed up. We'll also share the slides from today's session, so feel free to just fully lean back and don't think about all of the content that we're sharing. We'll be sharing all of that with you afterwards. Hopefully that will give you the opportunity to engage in our Q&A box down in the bottom, because we have dedicated a fairly big chunk of time to go into the Q&A. Some of you have already shared with us some questions that you would like us to go through, so we'll do some of that, but we will also do a good amount of live Q&As. So please do engage with us in today's session. Then just a little bit about what we will cover for today's session. So now I am talking, and if we can just go one back, please. Yeah, so I am talking, but I'll take a minute or two more, and then I'll head over to Ole later, because Ole will take us through the state of the play, as we call it. What is it that has changed with what we call the 131, this non-substantial change? And then he'll also afterwards take us over to what is the key directional shifts that we see in the science-based target V2 standard. And then we'll open the floor with a big Q&A where we have approximately 20-25 minutes. And then I'll do a neat and steady round off, and then we will say thank you for today. Now, please, next slide. For those of you who doesn't know us here at Nordic Sustainability, I thought it was worth just to spend 30 seconds talking a little bit about who we are. We are a sustainability strategy consultancy firm that is based here in Nordics, here in the Nordics, here in Copenhagen. We work mainly within 4 sectors within sustainability, which is strategy and implementation, reporting and policy, climate circularity and nature, and then sustainable finance and investments. We've been very lucky to work with some of the leading global companies. So we have a bunch of the Fortune 500, we have top 100 corporate knights, and then we work very sector agnostic. So we both work within the services, manufacturing companies, but also food and beverages, finances, and so on. We have fairly also diverse teams, so we're very international, and I think that also represents some of our international client base, since we have a lot of our since we have some of our lovely clients that we work with outside of Denmark as well. Now, let me take us over to the next slide, because I'm very honored today to be together with Eamon Murphy. In just a second, he'll get to introduce himself, but he's our associate manager here in our climate team. And then I also have with us Ole Høj Jacobsen, who's our principal in the climate team. Maybe, Eamon, do you want to put a bit of words on who you are and introduce yourself, and then give it over to Ole after?
Yes, so honored I get to go before Ola, but very nice to meet everyone. My name is Eamon. I'm an associate manager at Nordic, and I work pretty much exclusively with climate. So I help companies understand their climate impacts through greenhouse gas inventories, set targets to reduce them through science-based targets or similar, and then develop plans to actually achieve those targets through climate transition plans, decarbonization strategy, alongside a host of other smaller kind of bespoke projects. Yeah, very glad to be able to speak with you all this morning. And I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Ola, who will also do a lot of good speaking.
Thank you so much, Eamon. Thank you so much, Mina. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for spending the morning with us here. I'm Ole, and I lead our climate services here in Nordic Sustainability. I've been here for 6 years, and over those 6 years, I have helped a lot of companies through the science-based target setting process, also helped them in greenhouse gas inventories and climate transition plans and so on. But for the purpose of today, then I've spent a lot of my time with science-based targets, so I hope that I can share some interesting insights with you over the next 45 minutes. But really nice to be here with you. Thank you.
Great. And then Ole, I'm actually going to hand it over to you right away, because if we go to the next slide, then Ole will now take us through the state of the play, what has happened with the 131. So please go ahead, Ole.
Thank you so much, Mina. So, as Mina has already said, then we've structured this session in sort of 3 bits, where we'll speak a little bit about what has happened now, what will happen in the future, and then leave a lot of time for your questions, right? And I think there's 2 key shifts within science-based targets right now. One of them happened very out of the blue. There was what science-based targets has termed a non-substantial change to the way that we are setting targets right now. And then, of course, we have the V2 Net Zero Standard that is coming out later this year or early next year, that completely changes the way that we are setting science-based targets going forwards. But let's start with what has just happened now. Science-based targets, they released this version 131 of the Corporate Net Zero Standard. And in reality, not a lot has changed in the actual text of the standard. But even so, then this non-substantial standard has some quite substantial changes for a lot of companies. And it is in relation to the way that we are setting near-term targets using the absolute contraction approach. And that basically is our absolute reduction targets, where we are saying we want to reduce our absolute emissions with a certain percentage within the next 5 to 10 years. Science-based targets, we'll go a little bit more into what that change actually revolves around. But basically, science-based targets argumentation for doing this is that there were some quite strict requirements for companies who are setting targets now, very late in the 2020s, to have quite steep ambition levels, because they started setting targets later than a lot of other companies. Before, there was this requirement that we should count the minimum ambition level based on our target year and how far that is away from 2020. So if you're setting a target for 2030, then no matter when your base year is, it could be 2020, 22, 24, 2026, it would need to be the same minimum ambition level going back and counting from 2020. So the later you set targets, the more ambitious the targets, or you need to reach the same level of ambition, but you have shorter amount of time, which means that you will have to reduce your emissions by a lot each year. And science-based targets recognized that and said, okay, we need to make it more feasible for companies who are setting targets now to actually go ahead and make that change. So that's a lot of the rationale. It also aligns better with the V2 standard that we will be speaking a little bit about. It affects everyone. So everyone who's setting targets now or want their targets revalidated now will need to align with this new standard. And that has created a little bit of frustration for some companies who were very, very close to setting their targets, maybe already had them approved with the board, but just actually hadn't actually submitted the targets yet. So it has come a little bit as a surprise, but for some companies also been a positive development. And let's speak a little bit more about what that looks like on the next slide now. So 2 key pieces of change to the methodology. I spoke about this, that we needed to use 2020 as the reference year for counting minimum ambition before. And now when we are calculating the minimum ambition, we look at the starting year, the base year. So that basically means that if you're setting your base year at 2025, for example, then you have had a target year of 2030, then we used to be able to have a minimum 4.2% reduction per year starting from 2020. Now it's starting from 2025, which basically means that minimum ambition for Scope 1 has moved from 42% to 21% in this thought up case with a 2025 base year and a 2030 target year. For scope 2, there's been made a little change, so companies' targets tend to not just be we don't look at scope 1 and scope 2 combined with this new standard. You still set scope 1 and scope 2 targets, but the way that you calculate your ambition level depends on the division between your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Because with the power sector standard that Science Based Targets has also developed, then the expectation is that the power sector is going to reach net zero in 2040 already. And that basically means that we have less time until net zero. And that means that if we are following a linear pathway towards net zero, then we have less years, which means that each year we will have to be a bit more ambitious to achieve our targets. So in this thought up example with a base year of 2025 and a target year of 2030, then scope 2 targets needed to have the minimum ambition of 42% before, but now it's 33.3%. So also a reduction in the ambition level. Same for scope 3 here. The minimum ambition level before in this example was 25%. Now it's 15% here. So this, you can see that a general reduction in the ambition level here in the near term. But then that will also mean that going towards 2050, then of course companies need to start reducing more emissions then. Good. Okay, then let's move on to the second change in the methodology in this version 131 here. So there has also been a change in how we look at forward-looking ambition, because Science-Based Targets has this rule that we need to make sure that targets are still ambitious looking forwards. So before, if you wanted to use a base year of 2020, but you only set the targets in 2025, and you had actually managed to reduce your emissions significantly between 2020 and 2025, then Science-Based Targets would have gone in and they would have said, hold the phone. You need to still do a little bit more going forwards, but we will give you some credit for the reductions that you have made for 2020 and 2025, between 2020 and 2025. And there was different rules between scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3, and let's not get into that. But basically now Science-Based Targets is calculating the minimum ambition level based on your most recent year. So if you're submitting targets in 2025, then you will also submit a greenhouse gas inventory for 2024, 2025, and you are using that as the basis for your reduction. So in some thought examples, which we have heard about from companies, then they have been in this fantastic situation where they have actually managed to achieve quite a significant reduction between when they started reducing their emissions and now where they want to set their science-based targets. So in this thought up example, we have a company who've reduced their emissions, their scope 3 emissions with 30% between 2020 and 2025. If they wanted to set a target year for 2035, then they would have to, with the old standard, only reduce their emissions by 37.5% from towards 2035. That means that because they've already done 30%, then they only have 7.5 percentage points to go, right? So they are quite close to achieving their target, which gives them credit for actions already in the past. However, with this methodology change, then because these reductions have happened in the past and Science-Based Targets have changed the way of calculating the minimum ambition level, then suddenly the minimum ambition level, if you use 2020 as a base year, needs to increase because it needs to be forward-looking from the most recent year. So in this, again, thought up example, then a company will actually have to be significantly more ambitious in its target setting because of this change of methodology. And I think it's very important to say that Science-Based Targets, they've put some information out there, but there's still room for more information about this here. And I think the intention of having companies decarbonize as early as possible is not really very well reflected in this methodology change here. So some companies have been hit by it, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how Science-Based Targets starts reacting to those cases if companies start to complain. That was it on the 131. Then let's move swiftly over to the V2
And
standard.
yes, and just while we are doing that with the slides, I just want to remind everyone that we have the Q&A open, so feel free to use the chat and we'll take the questions as we go along.
Good. Okay. So the version 2 standard here. So far, we've been operating with the corporate net zero standard version 1, and then they've had 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. So there has been development, but it's still sort of within the same way of setting targets. Now, science-based targets have wanted to do this big revamp with a complete change of how we are setting targets going forward. So this is going to be the version 2.0 standard here. The standard is meant to be released already here towards the end of 2026. Perhaps they will be a little bit delayed. That has happened before with science-based targets, but at the very latest, it's going to come out early 2027. That's the expectation, and all companies will have to start using it from 1st of January 2028 when they are setting new science-based targets. So companies who already have existing science-based targets right now, the expectation is that they are going to be allowed to follow through with those targets. So this won't impact them until they have reached the end of that target time frame. But science-based targets has opened up for the opportunity to start transitioning into the new standard, but has not provided a lot of guidance about like how that is actually going to look like yet. And I think there's a very important point related to this, because this entire presentation is based on what the latest draft of the new standard looks like. And we've now had 2 drafts of the standard, so we are getting close to what we can expect to see in the final version, but we still have some pilot testing to be done, and there might still be some changes to the standard here. So we need to think about that. We have some really good direction of what the standard is very likely going to look like, but there still can be quite a few changes to the standard here. So everything that I'm presenting here is the direction that it looks like it's going right now, but there might be changes to it. So that's just a little FYI here. Good. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. One of the things that has changed is the way that science-based targets differentiates between different companies. So before we had different sets of rules for small and medium-sized enterprises and larger corporations, and then a different framework for financial institutions as well. The corporate net zero standard is very much built around V2 is very much built around small and medium sized enterprises, and larger companies and financial institutions has its own standards. So let's cover that in a different webinar, I think. Now we are not distinguishing between small and medium sized enterprises and large companies anymore. Some science-based targets have done a new categorization where we're speaking about category A companies and category B companies. And basically, larger companies will be in category A. No matter, you can see the specific requirements here on this slide here, but typically larger companies, no matter where they are in the world, will be category A companies. Medium-sized companies here will be either category A or category B, depending on where they are in the world and what the economic situation there is. And small and micro companies will be category B companies. And this influences the timeline for developing targets, whether there's a requirement for setting a net zero target, whether there's a requirement for developing a climate transition plan, the requirements for setting scope 3 targets, and the taking responsibility for ongoing emissions, which is all something that I'll dive a little bit more into here. The rest of the presentation is very focused on the category A companies, so the requirements for them, but it will be, you could say, less strict requirements for category B companies, and just wanted to put that out there. Good. Then let's go to the next slide. So there's a lot of things that has happened, and in a 45-minute webinar, we can't get through everything. So basically, I have taken some of the highlights out that I think is especially important. if you've read something else that you think is super interesting to go into, then again, put your question in the chat box, and then we'll try and go through it. But I'll take them a little bit one by one, and maybe let's go to the next slide. So before, it's been possible for companies to set both near-term targets, or only near-term targets, and net zero targets. With the V2 standard here, for category A companies, it's going to be mandatory to set net zero targets. So near-term targets by themselves are out. Let's go to the next one. Then we will still not have to focus on the end goal of 2050. We will have to do smaller interim targets, which works very much like the near-term targets that we have set before, where we are looking, where we are striving for some short-term actions here. But it will be a new way of setting targets that is than it's been before, and I'll go into that a little bit more. But there will be a much greater focus on intensity targets and alignment targets, where intensity targets is making sure that the CO2 intensity of some of the commodities that you're buying, for example, are in line with the net zero pathway, whereas alignment targets is making sure that, for example, suppliers or customers are aligned with a net zero direction. So have they set science-based targets, for example, here. So a new way of setting targets, which will change with each 5-year target as we get closer to the net zero target here, which for many companies will be 2050. Let's go to the next slide. Then there's a very interesting new development here, because before, science-based targets has not really required, science-based targets has said, like, we tell you how to set the targets, but then it's your job to sort of go ahead and achieve the target using the rules that we've set out for you. But checking whether the targets has been achieved has not really been part of how science-based targets does things in the past. Now, science-based targets will have a review of like how you're progressing within each of these 5-year target cycles here. So if you're setting targets for up until 2030, or for the period between 2030 and 2035, then towards the end of that target cycle, you will have a review of your targets to see how you have progressed on your targets. Let's go to the next one. Then also an interesting development, before, when you've submitted your targets to science-based targets, then you've been asked to describe at a very high level how you're planning on achieving your target. Now, science-based targets is asking for a formal climate transition plan, which needs to be submitted within 12 months of the initial validation. So right now, it's no longer enough to say that I'm planning to achieve this target. I've set this target and I'm planning to achieve it this way. Now we need to provide a whole lot more information about how this is actually going to be done. And also, very specifically, the plan, the climate transition plan, it needs to be approved by the highest level of governance within the company, right? Like, so it should really be very, very clear to the company that now we signed up to do this, and this is the pathway we are going on if we are going to get our science-based targets approved. Let's go to the next one. There's also a new development, whereas before, science-based targets have done all the validation of the greenhouse gas inventory themselves, of the targets themselves, but now science-based targets are requiring third-party assurance of various elements of the target setting process and the validation process here. So companies should expect to get third-party assurance for example, their greenhouse gas inventory, the calculated values that they're using for the metrics that they're going to be using to set the targets, how they're performing on the targets, and so on here. So this is also new. Then if we dive into Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 targets here, then we are now going to do different Scope 1 and Scope 2 targets. So before, we've seen a tendency towards that a lot of companies have succeeded with the Scope 1 and Scope 2 targets primarily by reducing their Scope 2 emissions. That has been the case for a lot of companies out there. But now Science-Based Target is saying Scope 1 is really, really important to reduce as well. And therefore, we need to split it up between a separate target for Scope 1, a separate target for Scope 2, separate targets for Scope 3 here. And if you go to the next slide, we can see a little bit more about what that looks like. So other than having different targets, then there's some quite interesting developments within each of the scopes as well. For Scope 1, there's being introduced a new target setting method, which is called the Asset Decarbonization Plan, whereas instead of looking at your entire Scope 1 emissions, then you can look at specific assets and come with decarbonization plans for those, and then set targets for the remaining of Scope 1 as well, or like have several Scope 1 targets for different assets. And it's quite a powerful way of making sure that if you have specific assets that's very, very challenging to do something about, then you can sort of scope them out a little bit and say, this is my plan for dealing with them. And there's quite a few requirements in relation to that we are not going to have time to go through. Can you go back to the previous slide? Thank you. Same as what we spoke about before with the 1.3.1 standard here, then we are moving away from this like ambition level starting in 2020 to a linear reduction from the most recent year towards your target year, right? Like so ambition level for these 5-year cycles is based on a linear reduction rather than having started in 2020, like we spoke about before. And then it is possible that you will end up with several targets for Scope 1, one for heat, for example, generated at your own sites, and one for vehicles, but it's still possible to aggregate it into your one overall target. For Scope 2, we are moving away from location and market-based targets. It's still optional to set those targets, but now it is mandatory to use low-carbon electricity targets, where we are going towards 100% low-carbon electricity towards 2040. And quite interestingly in that, then we are not speaking about renewable electricity anymore. We are speaking about low-carbon electricity, where science-based targets themselves talk about this as something that could also help us use, for example, natural gas with carbon capture and storage. That would also be an acceptable way of achieving the targets. It's also interesting to see that you can exclude heat and steam, district heat and steam, if it is not significant. So you can focus on your electricity if that's the vast majority of your emissions. The threshold is 5% of total Scope 2 emissions. Then there's a requirement that when we're using the market-based method here with when we're using the market-based method, then we need to source our electricity from newer generation facilities within that has been commissioned or recommissioned within the last 10 years, and that the time frame will be shorter as we go towards 2050. Then there is talk of introducing hourly matching instead of annual matching. So before, the certificates needed to be come from electricity generated from within the same year as it is consumed. Now, for larger companies and for a smaller part of electricity, it will be phased and become more and more significant as time goes. But they will start having to match electricity consumption with when it's being produced on an hourly basis. So this is quite the topic for quite a few companies right now. And Science-Based Targets is also directly saying that like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is updating their Scope 2 methodology. So when that has happened, they will also adjust based on that. Next slide, please. I'm using too much time, so in order to have time for question, I'll speed through this here. If we go to the next slide here on Scope 3, which is super interesting, then For Scope 3, Science-Based Targets is doing quite a few changes here as well. Instead of having a minimum threshold of covering 67% of Scope 3 emissions, which was the situation before, then now we are looking at significant emissions within Scope 3. So if you have a significant emission source or significant emissions category that exceeds 5% of your total Scope 3 emissions, then you have to set a target for that. That will very likely result in having many different targets instead of just one Scope 3 target instead. So we can expect to see that you have several Scope 3 targets, one for your Category 1 emissions, and maybe several for your Scope 3 Category 1 emissions, and separate ones for Category 4, Category 11, or the likes. Then again, we will transition towards away from absolute reduction targets for Scope 3 and go much more towards intensity targets or alignment targets that I spoke a little bit about before. And finally, Science-Based Targets is opening up for new methods to achieving Scope 3 targets. So before, you've had to prove that it's been your specific emission source within your Scope 3 emissions that is being decarbonized if you wanted to take that reduction and use it in your inventory, whereas now you can do reductions at the supply pool, for example, instead. So much more flexibility in the way that we are achieving our targets. Perfect. Next slide. The final thing that I want to go through here is that many of you who are into the Science-Based Targets world will know that Science-Based Targets has introduced this concept of beyond value chain mitigation and the concept of neutralizing emissions when you get to the net zero level. Now, Science-Based Target is saying we want more companies to start tackling emissions outside of their value chain if they don't reduce their emissions, or even if they are reducing their emissions, starting to tackle emissions outside of your value chain is also a very good way of making sure that we reach a net zero state out there. So if you go to the next slide, then I have a little bit of information about what that looks like. So for Category A companies, then they actually need to start neutralizing their emissions already from 2035 instead of in their net zero target year. So in 2035, the idea is that then you have to neutralize 1% of your remaining emissions, going on a linear trajectory towards 100% in 2050. And it's quite a smart thing because that also brings a very strong incentive to really making sure that we reduce the emissions going forwards, because if there starts coming a price tag to neutralizing emissions from 2035 already, then of course there's quite a powerful financial incentive to actually reducing emissions. There's also a way of getting much more credit for it starting to tackle emissions outside of your value chain. So Science-Based Targets have now created these new categorizations that you can be put into. If you tackle emissions outside of your value chain, you can either be recognized or achieve the leadership position here, where you will go on their website, have formal recognition for some of the great work that you're doing outside of the value chain. And there's different ways of achieving this status, different rules for doing it. But again, in the interest of time, I think I'll stop it here, and then please feel free to reach out if you want to learn more about that. That was
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ole. And I think this really showcase how complex and how broad this field is, because it's really difficult to narrow it down and speak short and concise about it, or very concise, Ole, but just very difficult to keep short because of the complexity. But thank you so much for that thorough walkthrough. I hope that was beneficial for everyone listening in here. And now let's move into the Q&A and discussion session. And thank you for everyone who's already submitted some questions. They are really, really interesting. And let's maybe just start with some of the foundational one, and then let's move from there. So maybe just, Eamon, could you just take us over in terms of when this V2 standard that Ole has just talked about, when do we expect the final version to be released, and how is that going to work also with the current one that we have in order?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief on this because I know Ola also mentioned it earlier, so it's a good listening quiz if you don't know the answer to this question already. But the final standard should be released later this year, hopefully. As Ola mentioned, science-based targets has been late in the past, so it's possible that it bleeds slightly early into next year, but let's see. The companies are expected to use this new standard as of July or January 1st, 2028. And in between when the final standard is released and that 2028 deadline, companies have the option of using the new net zero standard.
Amazing. Thank you, Eamon. And maybe just, Ole, we got a direct question to one of the first slides regarding the well below two scenario, where the question is, has that been phased out as an option, or is it still something that companies can use?
Super good question. So the well below 2 degree alignment has so far only been open to scope 3 targets, and it's still very much that is also what it looks like now with the 1.131 standard. We are still expected to achieve net zero for total operational and value chain emissions in 2050. And it's quite difficult actually to say whether the well below 2 degrees is still valid, because we are setting targets using scope 3 in a new way. We are not speaking about like this absolute contraction or in intensity reduction targets that we've had in the past. It's so much more about like putting targets on an alignment track towards net zero. So it's a super good question. I'm not entirely sure whether you would say that the 5-year interim alignment is more aligned with well below 2 degrees, or whether it's more aligned with net zero. I think it's very difficult to calculate the science of having a certain proportion of your suppliers that are aligned towards this trajectory, or not, saying that's well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. So I'm actually not completely sure how to answer it. It seems a little bit less relevant because we're not speaking about absolute reduction targets anymore. But if anybody has comments on this, then please fire them our way. It's a super interesting and very, very good question.
Yeah, but I guess still very much valid under the current 1.3.1 standard. It's just in V2 that there's maybe some uncertainty around the alignment there with well below 2C. But in 1.3.1, very much still an option, and that is the current standard.
Definitely. Thank you, Eamon. That is very important to say.
Good clarification from both of you. Thank you so much. Then I'll just take a couple of more questions to just some of the clarifications, one from the presentation that you did, Ola, and then I'll move into some of the questions that we got sent in. There is a question here in terms of, is it correct that companies from now on need to get a third-party assurance on their GHG inventories in terms of setting science-based target?
Category A companies do. Category B companies don't. So that's it. So that's quite as you could say, a strict development that has come from science-based targets here.
Yes, very good. And then one more. This presentation today here mentioned that net zero targets will be mandatory. Is that then correct that from the new standard that net zero would be mandatory for all companies for all scopes?
For category A companies, again, then that's correct. For category B companies, that's not the case. That's not the case yet. But it is quite interesting because there is a little distinction here where before, in order to set a net zero target, you have had a requirement to also set long-term targets, which is basically like the minimum reductions that you need to achieve in order to achieve this net zero standard, net zero status. But now, like, there's actually only these long-term requirements for scope 1 and very likely also scope 2, whereas for scope 3, then that part has been taken away and been made optional. And I think there's something interesting here because the long-term targets, we used to say that you need to reduce at least 90% of your emissions and then you can neutralize the rest. By taking this away, while still saying that value chain emissions needs to reach net zero, I think opens up for a little bit of like that the that science-based targets might go in a direction where you are allowed to neutralize more than the residual 10% that was required before. So no information is out about like the rationale for this, but like my interpretation could be that this is the kind of direction that they're moving in. Or we might see that the requirement just comes in later target cycles, like from 2035 to 2040, that then the long-term target needs to be set as well.
Thank you, Ole. Let's move on to another question. And Eamon, I'm going to shoot this over to your direction. So, how do you think that SBTi will handle companies that miss their targets despite of genuine efforts? And what do you think that happens to their credibility either way? Maybe both from a science-based target perspective, but also from a company perspective. Could you shed some light on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're all aware that many companies' short-term or near-term targets, target years are fast approaching. For many, that's 2030, 2035, or even a little bit earlier. And also, many companies are not on track to hit those targets. So that is something that's very much kind of on the horizon. In the new standard, I think they've taken a lot of steps to try to address to address this. So basically, companies will now be required to publicly disclose reasons for underperformance alongside planned corrective actions, and then annual progress reporting towards targets. Requiring them to flag these gaps and outline the steps that they will take in order to achieve those. They'll also have to disclose how their targets are dependent on other external developments and how that can impact their ability to achieve the targets. So in 2.0, there are a lot of changes being made to sort of reduce that buildup, but I think right now what we're seeing is that science-based targets has kind of demonstrated a willingness, in my view, with this release of 1.3.1 to sort of soften short-term targets in order to maintain a net zero trajectory. So with some of the changes that Ola had mentioned earlier, there's sort of the substitution for short-term action with maintaining long-term ambition. So I suspect that companies that are able to sort of openly address why they did not reach their targets, if that is the case, alongside instituting corrective actions and committing to decarbonization more long-term and achieving net zero by 2050, will be able to remain sort of in good standing with science-based targets. I think we have to remember that near-term targets are only one part of science-based targets, and not achieving a near-term target doesn't mean that climate action isn't worth doing or that the science-based targets should implode. We have to maintain the long-term view here. So I suspect that that's kind of where we'll be pivoting to in order to just maintain that absolute critical focus on reducing emissions over the long-term perspective.
Thank you so much for that, Eamon. I really enjoyed that positive spin you had there in the end. Definitely keep the long-term focus in play. And I'm just sitting here smiling as well because I see all of these great questions checking in the Q&A and also in the chat. So thank you very, very much for that. I think we have time for a couple of more questions, and I might even go a little bit over for the ones that has a couple of minutes more. But maybe just Ole, do you want to just also share a little bit of your thoughts on what Eamon just put out, and maybe also focusing a little bit in terms of this? Do you believe, with the understanding and the knowledge that you have, that science-based target would move towards a more strict pass-fail system, or do you think how do you think that it will progress in recognizing meaningful progress going forward, even when targets are not met fully?
I think it's super difficult to say what will happen with companies who are on the existing standard, because here we have no actual definition of how that's going to work from science-based targets. What we do know is that in the version 2 standard, then, like Eamon said here, it's not going to be pass and fail for near-term targets, right? Like you need to explain why, and you need to take corrective action. So very likely you will just have to be more ambitious in the future if you did not succeed with your near-term targets here. for companies who have targets now, who are in this situation where it's difficult to achieve the targets, then science-based targets have spoken about like how you, with existing targets, can start transitioning into the new target, and that I think could then provide some hope that it will also be possible for these companies to then explain why and take corrective action. And that might mean that the ambition level for the companies who have not achieved their targets needs to increase going forwards. But again, science-based targets haven't provided a lot of information exactly on what that looks like. But I would say there is hope there.
Hmm.
Maybe just adding on to that, I think under the new net zero standard as well, there's lots of different target types and sub-target types. So, for example, setting
Oh, I think we maybe lost Eamon there
a
for
target supplier or could. Oh, sorry.
maybe you're back.
So there are different kind of sub-target types that companies can set, including supplier use of low carbon energy or electricity. So this will allow companies to also focus on communicating wins where they have had wins, even if it hasn't sort of directly translated to hitting absolute emissions reduction targets. I would encourage companies to take a look at the different sub-target options that you have, and if you're working with one of those, then that can also be a very strong sort of communication point and way to demonstrate progress.
Thank you so much, Eamon, for the additional context there. And maybe just recognizing now that we are actually on time. It's 9:45. And if any of you have to go on with your day, then of course feel free to tap out. I'll just take one last question. And Ola, I'm gonna shoot it over to you. It's about this constant conflict that we see within hitting climate targets, but also be a company that wants to grow and also have high ambitions for climate. How do you see that companies that are on a steep growth trajectory also aligning and having robust and credible science-based target goals? How do you see that that
I think
kind of
that
sit in the same? Hmm?
Yeah. I think that gets significantly easier with the V2 standard, because we are increasingly moving away from these absolute reduction targets that has made it very difficult, right? Like so even if you grow, then like you can still make sure that the materials that you are using are sourced like with a certain amount of low CO2 intensity. So I would say that the new standard really opens up for companies being able to grow and both like financially and in terms of selling more products. But it of course it does require that the more you produce, the more you sell, the greater the number of materials that you consume needs to be on this very low carbon, net zero carbon trajectory. I think the one thing that's also worth mentioning in this context is that you are still within science-based targets. You still need, you're still required to report your scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 emissions annually. And that means that, of course, like even if you're on a pathway to achieving your science-based targets, but ends up increasing total emissions, then like that will still need to be reported. And you can then go out and say, hey, we are working on achieving our science-based targets. This is what we have targets for. But we might still, like companies might still be open to criticism, of course, from external sources, not science-based targets, for having increased their emissions over time. So I think the science-based target is making it easier, but you still do need to report scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions.
Thank you so much, Ole. That was a great answer to also a very complex one, and one that I think we get a lot of questions on from most of our clients. So thank you for shedding some light on that. Now we are unfortunately at the end of the webinar, and I don't think I can take any more time. So there's only one last thing to say, and that's Ola and Eamon, thank you so much for joining in today, and thank you for moving us through this very complex field. And then thank you to everyone who've joined in for today. Thank you for the engagement, all of the great questions. And if you have any more questions that we haven't covered today, then always feel free to reach out to us. We would love to continue talking about this nerdy topic. So yeah, feel free to reach out, and thank you so much for spending your morning with us.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.